Your market news now. Asian stocks were cheered by signs of a recovery on Wall Street last night, but players remained cautious about uncertain factors, including the real possibility of the US's withdrawal from the Iran deal. Tokyo stocks rose today on the back of positive sentiment around other equities markets on the rise, while Japan's Takeda surged on reports that the drug maker would make a formal offer to buy Ireland's Shire. The benchmark Nikkei share average gained 0.18%. In Hong Kong, shares traded in positive territory on news that a Chinese official would be going to the US next week to resume those trade talks with the United States. The Hang Seng Index added 1.2%. China's stocks posted robust gains amid hopes that the resumption of US-China talks could help avert a trade war, while the impending MSCI inclusion of China shares rekindled interest in blue chips. The Shanghai Composite Index gained 0.8%. And over in the United States, Wall Street stocks climbed last night, boosted by Apple's sixth straight day of gains and a surge in oil prices to their highest level since 2014. Oil giants Chevron and ExxonMobil were among the biggest gainers in the Dow as US oil prices crossed $70 a barrel on speculation that President Donald Trump will withdraw the US from the Iran nuclear deal. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 0.39%, the S&P 500 gained 0.34%, while the tech-heavy Nasdaq Composite Index added 0.77%. Well, global markets are mixed today, and the big item that market players will be looking at is what will Mr. Trump announce in reference to Iran later today. Will the US reimpose sanctions on that country? And if it does, what will it mean for companies like MTN, which struggled to repatriate funds from that country when there was a sanctions regime before? Well, the all-share index started today's session in the black, but has regressed into the red, with mining counters being the main drag for today. And after gaining some ground earlier in the session, the local currency is trending lower against the US dollar again. That currency has been generally firing on all cylinders on positive news around the country's growth and a recently reported lower unemployment number. Oil prices have lost a little bit of ground, but Brent crude continues to trade firmly above $75 a barrel. This, of course, when set against a weaker rand currency, can only mean bad news for us in the South African economy, as higher and higher petrol prices look more likely. Let's take a look at the indicators. Well, for one reason or another, I couldn't get an analyst in today. So Francis and I are going to have a brief conversation to give some of our insights on what's happening on the global and local markets. So the big thing, of course, as we mentioned, is the fact that Donald Trump is scheduled to announce maybe around between 7 and 9 p.m. South African time, what he's going to do in terms of Iran. It's largely expected that he'll withdraw the United States from that deal, which, as Francis did mention earlier, is a deal that comprises European nations, the US and other nations. And of course, there's been an appeal that the United States remains within that deal. Now, if that does happen, it has very adverse effects because it could mean sanctions will be imposed on Iran. So we're going to have a chat about that, aren't we, Francis?
Indeed.
Okay.
So I think the main thing to watch is oil. So like you said, above $75 for the first time since 2014. And I've been watching oil since I moved into business anchoring. I remember it was way above 100, and at that time people were saying this is going to be hugely serious. But it came down. But yeah, Iran is so important for oil production. So the less supply you have, the less production you have, the higher the prices, because oil becomes more rare. And of course, OPEC, with Saudi Arabia in the lead and Iran part of that group, has already been trying to curb supply. So this would be a natural curb if there are economic sanctions against Iran. And it can tip that whole balance of supply and demand. So people are talking about right now a surplus of oil in the world, because of course the US is trying to compete with OPEC and they're trying to deal with the US. But we're now looking at a shortage. So it's really interesting what's happening.
And it's a real possibility. I think Iran produces about 2 million barrels a day. And on top of that, Venezuela is having lots of production problems. You know, that country is besieged with problems and people are starving in that particular nation and so on. And yet they have lots and lots of oil reserves, which is another story. So shortages from Venezuela and Iran could put a lot of pressure on supply. And, you know, economics 101, when supply is when supply is less than demand, that puts upward pressure on prices. And of course, with the rand weakening, as we're seeing it these days, hovering around 12.50 against the US dollar, then it will likely mean that we're going to get a transfer of that increase into our local petroleum prices, fuel prices. We've seen a couple of hikes over the past couple of months, and that looks set to continue.
So exactly, so higher fuel prices, that's driven by the oil price itself, but also in combination with the weaker rand. A weaker rand then pushes up a whole range of imports. And I think we need to remember, some people love a weaker rand. I think the only reason why those miners are not up on the markets today is because the gold price is actually reacting to a stronger dollar. Otherwise, they like a weaker rand. But it's worth noting, I think, that South Africa is still reliant on imports. We still import more than we export, and that's what people use in their day-to-day goods. So we should be worried about those imports. So a weaker rand means all our imports get more expensive, and that leads to inflation, which affects everybody. So huge economic ramifications.
On to that issue of MTN. They have operations in Iran. I think they've got about 49% stake in a Iran MTN venture. And if you remember, when there were sanctions against Iran, it hit MTN hard. They were making lots and lots of revenues, but they weren't able to shift the money that was stuck in Iran because of the sanctions.
Yeah, so I think they got their money out. To be honest, I haven't kept up with those details. But MTN is interesting because since the Iranian deal, there were questions about should you be doing business with a regime who is possibly doing a nuclear development on the side, and a whole range of other issues. And it's such an important business question. What do you do when you're operating in a country with rules very different to your own? What about China and suppression of media, things like that? So it raised a lot of questions at the time. And then, of course, came Nigeria, where MTN was fined for behaving badly and not switching off subscribers, not complying with Nigerian legal requirements at the time. And I think since then, MTN has really been on a reputation recovery effort. And to me, the most interesting and the most stark is, I guess, a sign that that recovery has happened very well, or MTN has recovered, is that SABC Jonas has agreed to join the team. The squeaky clean former finance minister who actually ratted out on the Guptas and was lauded for that, and I think believed by South Africans in general. So I think, yeah, they won't want to talk about Iran again, but still what MTN does is goes into markets and just waits. Even though consumers may not have the cash yet, as soon as things turn around, obviously the beneficiary, the one who's already in that market, can benefit.
Thank you very much, Francis, for assisting me with your insights on that. And of course, the positive thing for MTN is that they're in the Nigerian market. That accounts for about 30% of their revenue. And, you know, if oil prices are on the rise, it's good for Nigeria because they're an oil exporting country. And that will surely be good for MTN, even if there's a negative in Iran.